Okay, thank you. So I realize I'm the person standing between you and the coffee break, so I'll try to get us through this fairly quickly. So this is work of mine with my co-author, Kevin Milligan. Unfortunately, could not make it here today. This paper will look a little bit familiar to at least a few people in the audience. It's work that we were doing with the NBR's International Social Security Program. And we decided that within the Canadian context, it was worth taking it a little bit further to see what else we could do with the Canadian data. So that's what we brought here today. Start us off with a bit of Canadian policy context for this paper. Here what I've mapped out is life expectancy at birth since 1921 for men and women in Canada. And here I'm thinking about the life expectancy at birth rather than at 65, because I'm thinking about a young voter and what kind of policies they might support and what they might think of as Ari was calling it, a good anchoring age, or what is a good retirement age that we would be willing to help people out afterwards. And when we look at the 1920s, this is when we introduced our first old age pension. This was a very small income-tested benefit that people could start receiving at the age of 70. Now, from the perspective of a young voter whose life expectancy is around age 57, they might view this as something like a longevity insurance. They are very unlikely to actually make it to that age and enjoy those benefits. Over time, we see life expectancy steadily increase for men and women in Canada. 1951 is when we introduced the Old Age Security Program as we know it today, or at least the bulk of it today. At age 70, you could receive a demo grant. The income-tested benefit was available to individuals at age 65. Life expectancy for men here was 66 years old. So young voters thinking they might possibly see this benefit for a year or two when they reach those older ages. 1967, this is when we bring in our Canada Pension Plan, our contributory pension, and so we also revise ages in our other programs. That income-tested benefit is now available at age 65 as well as the demo grant. And then in 1975, we introduced the allowance, which gives benefits to spouses of pensioners as early as age 60 on an income-tested basis. And from there on, we just continue to see life expectancy continue to increase, and these anchoring ages, now set at 65 and 60, have not moved in several decades. Okay? So what we want to look at in this paper is we first see that we have these very large increases in life expectancy, improvements in mortality, and that's continues to change over time. We see that line up with some measures of increases in healthy life expectancy. And when you bring together a large body of literature, it tends to suggest that over time, individuals' health conditional on age has also improved. Okay, so people are getting healthier over time. What we want to know is whether or not individuals are also more capable of working than what we observe, and if that's increased over time as well. We're going to take on a purely descriptive exercise here. We aren't going anywhere near any kind of difficult modeling or any kind of causality. What we're going to do is just describe the extent to which we think people might be able to work more at older ages. We're going to use some really crude measures of health. Mortality risk is, of course, the crudest thing you could think of. You're either alive or dead. That's your measure of health. We are going to look into our survey data to think about health conditions a bit more finely, and we're going to line that up against employment rates and create some reference groups. That's going to help us think about the extent to which people might be able to work more than we're observing them. Just to sort of highlight some of the findings, give you a sense of where we're going to be going. When we look at the relationships between employment and mortality and how those have changed over time, what our data is suggesting to us is that a lot of men in 2012 should be, or I shouldn't say should, I'm going to be very careful there, could be working up to 5 years more if they were working at the same rate given their risk of mortality as they were in 1976. When we look at women and perform the same exercise, we're looking at women being able to work about 2 years more, depending on the reference groups involved. Some other estimates based on more recent microdata, we're looking at men 60 to 64 being able to have employment rates that are 29 percentage points higher than what we're observing in the more recent data. In terms of the data we're using, we're bringing together various sources. Anybody here who's worked with the Canadian data a lot knows that we don't have a lot of great data to work with when we're trying to study things like health and employment and income over long periods of time. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our research data center versions of our labor force survey. From that, we're going to be able to get some age-specific employment rates. It's not available in the public use files. We are keeping women in our samples. We're going to talk about women. It's always tempting in labor economics to just put them aside because women's histories are so much more difficult to understand and analyze. But when we do talk about employment and mortality relationships, one thing we're going to try and do is take a subsample of women who report having worked since the age of 45. So when we're looking back at 1976, there's a lot of women who are in their 40s and 50s who have no work history whatsoever. So trying to judge some sort of work capacity against that as a reference group isn't going to make a lot of sense. So I'm just going to have you keep that in mind. We're also going to try and think more beyond just employment. People might be able to work more if they're working part-time. They might be able to increase their hours. So we're going to look at that as well. In terms of mortality rates, we're taking the mortality rates out of the Human Mortality Database. We have those up to 2011. More recently, StatCan life tables came out, so we're going to update that to 2012. We also have our Canadian Community Health Survey. This is not something that we have a long history for. They only go back to 2001. But they started introducing this survey every 2 years at that time, and then it carries through annually up to 2014. So we're going to use the files that we have available there at the Research Data Center. In those files, there's not a lot of labor market information, but we at least have a question that says, were you employed this week? Okay, so we're going to use that to define employment status. And then they do have large sets of questions to describe the prevalence of individuals' health conditions, some self-reported measures of health, things like obesity measures and smoking behavior that we're going to try and make use of here, as well as some basic demographics. Now, to give you a sense of, realizing you can't see the top of my slides, to give you a sense of what employment rates in Canada have looked like, I think this picture is probably familiar to most people. The most interesting trend that we like to talk about here is with our men aged 60 to 64. We saw a very large decline in their employment rates all the way into the mid-1990s, and then they've been increasing quite steadily ever since then. Okay? You see something very similar for men who are 65 to 69, with declining into the mid-1990s, and then really taking off here after the year 2000. Okay? Now, if you were to look at just women who were single, they actually look fairly similar in terms of this U-shaped trend that we see for men. But for all women, so these are a majority married women, their employment rates were very steady right up to mid-1990s, and then after that, they take off and start to increase. So this is largely reflecting the fact that when you're looking at this cohort of older women in the late 1990s and early 2000s, these are the first women who gained access to full access to the pill. Okay, so this is really just capturing some cohort effects there, or largely capturing. Now here, we're looking at age-specific mortality rates, and each line is a different year. So for instance, the orange dashed lines here are looking at women's mortality rates at each age. And you can see that from 1976, then 1994, and then 2012, those mortality rates are steadily dropping. Okay? For men, we see even larger drops in mortality rates at each age over time. An interesting thing, if you did map in the 1950s here, that's where the large drop happened for women. Okay? They just got to enjoy that earlier. I believe the literature suggests that men didn't enjoy that because they continued smoking way too much. They might be doing better. But otherwise, you see here that by 2012, men's mortality rates are really just starting to catch up to the 1994 women. Okay? So what we're going to do next is really a graphical exercise, purely descriptive. What we want to do is map these two things together, individuals' employment rates at each age and their mortality rates at each age. And we're going to create a really simple scatter plot, bringing those two together into the same graph. Okay, so we're going to bring together employment and mortality at each age for 1 year, and then we're going to bring in a second year as a reference group so we can think about how this changes over time. What we want to look at in these next couple of graphs is think about mortality risk as the health condition that we want to condition on, and what is your employment conditioning on that level of health. Here's what it looks like when we do this for men. So the red dotted line here is mapping out employment rates and mortality rates and their relationship in 2012 for men. Okay, so high employment rates, low mortality at age 55, and then we connected the lines just to show that eventually your mortality rates go up and your employment rates go down with each age. We do the same for 1976, okay? And the obvious thing is that for each and every possible mortality rate, employment rates in 1976 are much higher than what we see in 2012. So for example, here when we pick this dot here, this is age 64. The employment rates of men at age 64 in 2012 are about 48%. The employment rates in 1976 for the same level of mortality risk are upwards of 86%. And this gap between the two is suggesting the extent to which 64-year-old men in 2012 could be working more than they currently are. Okay? Now, given that this is for each year of age, we can think of that as a part year. When you integrate between the two lines, you get a nice summary measure of how many more years these men could be working in 2012. So if you were to add up all of those spaces, that's the sum of gaps here, this is where we suggest that men in 2012 between these ages could be working 5 more years than we currently observe them doing. Okay. Now we repeat that for women. Now here, this is where I say we took this subsample of women who have an employment history. So they've indicated that they have worked since age 45. If you don't do that, you get a weird cross in these lines because women in 1976 at younger ages had very low employment rates generally. In any case, here we have the same kind of thing. We have this line, the red line here is representing that relationship between employment and mortality in 2012. The 1976 relationship has a line that is above that. And if you were to fill in all of these gaps all the way along, we would suggest that women in 2012 could be working 2 years more than what we are currently observing them do. So then we decided to look at a few other dimensions. Here's one of the examples that we put together to look at average hours. And here I brought them into the same graphic. It makes it kind of messy with all the numbers. But brought them into the same graphic just to highlight the fact that first, women's mortality rates generally are much, much lower at each age than men, and that just sort of highlighted in these graphs, but also that this gap between the 1976 relationship and the 2012 relationship is so much smaller for women than it is for men when you bring them into the same scale. Okay? But this is looking at hours. So for example, at the same death rate here, men in 2012 are working about 20 hours per week. That's their usual average. And at the same mortality risk in 1976, it was much closer to 40 hours a week. Okay? If you add that up all together, men in 2012 could be working 85% more hours than what we observe, and women in 2012 could be working 35% more hours than what we're observing. Okay. Now, one thing to recognize in all of this is that we can't really pin down a measure, a precise measure of what individuals' capacity to work is or how much they could be working. The most that we can do here is pick a reference point and say, relative to that point, how much more could people be working? Okay, and so we have 1976 as being our main reference point simply because that's when we started the labor force survey. So that's when we have employment rates that we can line things up against in a historical context. If, for instance, you were to move along this x-axis here and pick later and later reference points, okay, our measured capacity to work, those total number of years that we think you could work more, that diminishes. Okay? So that's just an important caveat to keep in mind whenever we're looking at results here. The interesting thing that does come out of this graph is that most of that capacity to work that we're measuring is coming in with this divergence between improvements in mortality and increases in employment rates up to the mid-1990s. After that, we see increases in employment rates. Women's increases in employment rates have actually been enough to more than match the improvements in mortality rates. So that's why this kind of comes negative here. And then here, we see the employment rates of men have been nearly large enough to match the improvements that we see in their mortality rates. So the story here is really this 1970s, 80s, and early 90s story where these two trends were diverging. Now, one thing that we wanted to do in the Canadian context was also think about some regional differences and how things might vary across the country. If you're in Canada, it's a very large country, very diverse country, and we like to compare what's going on across provinces. So I'll start here with this first line. This is really comparable to those graphs that I was just showing you. Okay, we lined up the employment-mortality relationships, looked at how they varied over time. Here, instead of men in 2012, we're thinking of men in Ontario in the 2000s, okay? And saying, well, what if their employment rates were the same, conditional on their mortality risk, as males in Ontario in the 1970s? And that's where they would be working over 5 years more than what we currently observe them doing. Each of these is choosing a different reference group. Okay, so what if men in Ontario in the 2000s worked as much as women in Ontario in the 2000s, conditional on mortality risk? They would be working much less. Okay, you could flip that around and think that might indicate that there's much larger capacity for women to work in Ontario in the 2000s. Okay? One of the interesting things that came out of here was in comparing provinces, and you'll notice that our little bars here for what that potential years of work relative to men in Ontario is, it's very small, less than 1 year, when we're looking at BC, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces, okay? Which is actually kind of interesting because we know that the employment rates historically in the Atlantic especially have been much, much lower than what you would find in Ontario. It's often, the example. The reason this number is so small is because those low employment rates are matched by higher mortality rates at each age. Okay? So conditional on our mortality risk, their employment rates are actually fairly comparable to that in Ontario, suggesting only a small potential to increase their labor supply there. And then finally here with the United States, to think about if men in Ontario worked as much as the men in the United States did, conditional on their mortality, we would see a couple more years being worked in Ontario. Okay, so then, this didn't take me nearly as much time as I thought I should have. So then this is we wanted to move on and think a bit more about finer measures of health. And not just are you alive or are you dead, a lot can be happening while you are alive. So we decided to try and dig as much as we could out of our available survey data, and that's where we're using the Canadian Community Health Survey. This is starting in 2001, going up to 2014. The samples in this survey are not large enough to really try to use it as a time series for our purposes, so we're going to just pool together all of these survey years and do the best we can with that. What we're going to do here, we need its reference group. In our previous analysis, we were using 1976 men, for instance, as our reference group. What we're going to do here is pick out men between the ages of 50 and 54, and we're going to use them as our reference group for what a potential capacity to work could look like. Okay? Now, we're picking the 50 to 54 because we want to grab a group that has not yet been hit by the large pension incentives that tend to start at age 55 in the private sector, or in private pensions, I should say, and then age 60 and over with our public pensions. What we're going to do is we're going to take this group and we're going to estimate a very simple probit model for whether or not they are employed, conditioning on various health characteristics. So our first set of characteristics here is the prevalence of health conditions. We have things like, do you suffer from conditions related to heart disease or stroke and arthritis and diabetes and these sorts of things. These are all self-reported, of course. We're going to condition on whether or not they smoke. We have measures of obesity, sort of the overweight, trying to remember what we called the morbidly overweight and underweight. And then also we try to account for how many conditions you might be suffering from simultaneously to get more at the severity of health conditions and how they affect individuals. We also account for self-assessed health. So this might get more at the severity of health conditions and whether or not you feel you can work. So these are simple measures where they ask people to rate their own health from poor to excellent. And so we'll include a group of indicators there. And then we also use specifications that allow for various demographics. Okay, now I'm going to just kind of tell you that in the results I'm going to show you for the simulations today, it really doesn't matter if we include these or not. There are it'll change the regression coefficients in important ways because there's important interactions between these demographics that reflect your socioeconomic status and all of our health measures. Okay, but they won't matter as much in terms of getting to a predicted employment rate. So anyways, so those will be included in our estimates as well. We're going to use this to predict the employment rates of men and women at older ages. A key assumption here is with these coefficients. So we're estimating this using a group of 50 to 54-year-old men, and it's going to assume that your employment, conditional on these characteristics, that relationship characterized by these coefficients, that does not change with age. Okay? It's an important caveat in interpreting this. So I decided not to bore you with tables of regression coefficients and descriptive statistics. I'm going to jump right to the results that we have here. So this first column is looking at men 50 to 54. Their employment rates are 87%. Okay? The tops of all of these columns are the simulated or predicted employment rates okay, using the coefficients that came out of that probant model. So we use those coefficients to predict what the employment rates of 50 to 59-year-olds would be, given their health and these characteristics that we've controlled for. So that's the top of this bar here. And the thing to realize first is that as people age, so as we go from 50 to 54 up to 70 to 74, we do see people's health worsen. This is, of course, the people who survive to each of these ages. We see their health worsen. We expect their employment rates, conditional on that health, to fall gradually over time, but it's very slow, small changes with each age. What we mapped in here with the blue bars is, of course, our observed employment rates, and those fall much more quickly with each of these ages. Okay? What that suggests then, that's the pink areas here, is some unused capacity. Conditional on your health, you could be working much more. So for instance, our 60 to 64-year-old men here, we see employment rates over this period of 55%. Their employment rates could be 29 percentage points higher than what we observe. Okay, that's fairly substantial. Now, we repeated the exercise for women. Here we've kept our men age 50 to 54 as our reference group. Their employment rates at 50 to 54 are 77%, suggesting an unused capacity within that age group of 8%. So that just reflects sort of a general difference between men and women in terms of how much they're working at these ages. The same gradual decline expected in a potential to work as one ages. But again, as with men, you see a very steep decline in employment rates that nowhere near matches that. Okay? Just to point out here, again, we repeat several times in the paper that reference group matters in trying to gauge what that unused capacity might be. So here we ran the probits using samples of women instead of samples of men. So that's here, women are the reference group, and it's women age 50 to 54. It doesn't really change the shape of the extent to which you would expect employment conditional on health to decline with age. It doesn't really change much in terms of the total unused capacity that we're measuring here. The difference between the pink bars given the reference groups is really this 8% that we saw here, sort of that general difference between men and women. And so it's giving us, I think, a fairly consistent measure of some unused capacity for work. Now, we also tried to do some regional comparisons here. And so I'll sort of pick out the Atlantic as one that we often use for comparisons. Here, our 50 to 54-year-old men in Ontario are the reference group. Okay? Men in the Atlantic have employment rates in this group, 79%. If they worked as much as men in Ontario, conditional on their health and characteristics, they would work 7 percentage points more. So that's the general gap between Ontario and the Atlantic provinces. Again, in all of these cases, we see a very gradual decline across ages with the potential employment rates. What's interesting is that, again, these gaps across provinces aren't nearly as large as one might expect. When, for instance, you're comparing older individuals in Ontario and in the Atlantic, that unused capacity at some of these older ages, there's a gap there, but it's not nearly as large as I think some people might have expected. So that's sort of the key results coming out of this paper. I'm just going to emphasize for you. We think that men in these older age groups, say 55, 69, could be working 5 years more than what we're currently observing. Women could be working between 2 and 5 years more than what we observe. The employment rates of men age 60 to 64, those could be about 29 percentage points higher. For women, it's 43 percentage points higher. It's a bit of a larger gap there. And then I want to emphasize all of those caveats, especially for the non-economists who tend to look at this. We have to emphasize the point that this is something we do not get to observe. We never get to just ask somebody, well, could you be working more, and expect and to be able to elicit a true response to that. We certainly don't have anything in our data sets that would allow us to observe that very directly. And so this is really just trying to get a sense of the extent to which we think people could be working more. We do have to recognize that the health measures we use, we have simple indicators. Do you have a heart condition? Do you suffer from conditions associated with a stroke? That doesn't necessarily tell us much about the severity of those conditions. And that matters in thinking about that relationship between our health measures and employment at these older ages. So to that extent, we might be overstating some of the capacity in the data that we're presenting. again, emphasize the point that that capacity will depend on reference groups. So I think our estimates give you a nice range, an idea of what kind of capacity might be there. We aren't going to be able to claim to pin down a specific number for what capacity is. I also point out, and this is sort of where the Atlantic estimates it's come in as a nice example, these don't speak to actual opportunities for employment. Okay? It might be nice for individuals in the Atlantic to say that they could work more, but if nobody is offering them a job, it's not an option. And I think that's often the type of barriers that people talk about when they're thinking about older workers who might want to go back to work. And that's not going to be captured here in any way. They also do not speak to heterogeneity. There is clearly very diverse needs in our older population. Some individuals, you see professors marching down those halls as professor emeritus till they drop. Other people cannot do that in their jobs. It's not necessarily an option. And so we have to think about heterogeneity in health and also in the opportunities that people have. And then finally, again, just to emphasize, I will never claim that people should work more, only that they could if given the opportunity. Thank you.